Welcome to one of my GH6 reviews in this epic series where I put the newest Micro Four Thirds powerhouse through its paces. Today we will take a look at the noise performance of the GH6 in all its different recording modes and for example 5.7K, 4K and Full HD in its full sensor readout and also in its pixel by pixel mode. But not only that, we will also compare the GH6 to its predecessor, the GH5, and the full frame model, the Panasonic S1. Keep in mind, the GH5 has the same sensor as the Panasonic G9 and has more or less the same sensor as the GH5 Mark II, albeit the GH5 Mark II has a little bit of an updated sensor with a little bit of higher dynamic range, but the noise performance should be the same. Also regarding the Panasonic S1, this is a full frame powerhouse with a great sensor, and similar cameras like the Panasonic S5 and the S1H have the same sensor. The S1H has one difference, it has an AA filter in front of the sensor, therefore the image is a bit softer, but the noise performance should be the same. This sensor is also featured in other cameras such as the Sony A7 III for example. So if you're wondering how the GH6 fares regarding noise performance in comparison to the GH5 and the S1, this is the video for you. But keep in mind, I'm a videographer who mainly shoots wedding videos and corporate videos, so if you're interested in other fields that this camera can do, you should subscribe to the channel and check out the following videos where I will tell you what I think about this camera in general. Speaking of the test setup, I used the same lens on all three cameras. I used the 24-70 f2.8 from Sigma with a Canon mount. I adapted it with the MC21 adapter on my S1 and with the Metabones Speedbooster XL onto the GH5 and the GH6. And sorry if the focus isn't always the same, the focus changes with the crop ins and the pixel by pixel readout, and I had to zoom in and out to match the frame, so it's not always perfect, sorry for that, but this is not a sharpness test, this is a noise test, so if you're interested in sharpness comparisons, I will do another video on that. All cameras have the noise reduction and the sharpness turned all the way down, and I use the V-Log profile and the V-Log L profile on the GH5, so they are more or less comparable. All three cameras have slightly different colors, they have a little bit of different color science, but I tried to match them as good as possible. Also, all clips are scaled to fit onto a UHD timeline, since I think that's what you and me are using the most often. So the 5.7K footage from the GH6 is scaled down to 72% and the 5.9K footage from the S1 is scaled to 66%. And all the full HD footage is scaled up by 200%. So when you see a crop in, the percentage is in relation to a UHD timeline. Let's start with the GH6 where we look at the ISO performance in all its resolutions. In 5.9K the image looks very nice with hardly any visible noise from ISO 250 to ISO 800. Also ISO 1600 looks great. When the dynamic range boost kicks in at ISO 2000, we don't see much difference in noise, but the color changes just a slight bit. Also ISO 3200 still looks great and perfectly usable. Only at ISO 6400 is where I would say that the noise is visible, especially in the darker areas. But it's very organic and reminds me of film grain, very usable in my opinion. ISO 12800 is a big degradation in comparison to ISO 6400. But I think it's still usable for certain situations. I'm honestly a bit surprised. I wasn't thinking that the camera would hold up this well up to the maximum, since I thought the GH6 has smaller pixels on the sensor than its predecessor. Unfortunately, 12,800 is the highest we can go on this camera, and I think the camera has still some reserves to go up a little bit higher. You will know what I mean when we come to the comparison between the GH6 and the S1 and the GH5. But what about 4K UHD, which is a far more common recording format? Especially when you think about that this camera can capture 4K with 120 frames per second. Well, the story seems to be the same. There is hardly any difference in noise performance between 5.7K and 4K. Maybe the UHD is a hair more noisy, but I wouldn't bet on it. I wasn't able to spot a significant difference. In Full HD it's the same story, there is hardly any difference, I couldn't see it, and so it's great to see that no of the full sensor readouts is crippled in any way. When we engage the pixel by pixel readout in UHD, the sensor only reads out a UHD portion in the center of the frame. This is where we see the rise of noise. We see about a stop of noise difference between the full sensor readout and the crop mode. This is no surprise since we are cropping in by a factor of 1.5, which should translate to a difference of a stop. So ISO 6400 in crop mode is about as noisy as ISO 12800 in the full sensor readout. The ISO 12800 in the pixel by pixel crop mode should be an indicator what we could expect from a full sensor readout in a theoretical ISO 25600. And well, it's already very green, but in all honesty there is still a lot of detail that you could fix with neat video and a little bit of color grading. When we hit full HD in the pixel by pixel readout, there is a drastic difference between the full sensor readout in full HD and the crop mode. We start to see noise already at the base ISO, and when we go up to ISO 1600 we already have the same noise levels as we can see at ISO 12800 in the full sensor readout. This is to be expected since the crop factor of the GH6 in the pixel by pixel in full HD is a factor of 3. In comparison to a full frame, that would be a crop factor of 6. We look further down at ISO 1600 and 2000, the noise is already quite visible. At 3200 the image is already quite degraded, and at ISO 6400 is already very colorful. I would only use that ISO if I have to. 12800 is unusable in my opinion. As you can see, the GH6 doesn't hold back when it comes to noise performance. I would comfortably use the camera up to ISO 3200, and when in a pinch I would also go up to 6400. Documentary filmmakers might also use the 12800 mode, but not in the pixel by pixel readout in UHD, where I would say that 6400 is the highest that I would go if I had to. But the full HD readout in the pixel by pixel mode is not that nice. I would honestly only go up to ISO 1600 if I had to, and all above that is not usable in my opinion. But now we will battle the GH6 against its already legendary predecessor, the Panasonic GH5. How much did change in the last 5 years? In UHD at full sensor readout we can already see a tiny amount of noise in the GH5 footage, but only if we zoom in quite a lot. At ISO 800 the GH6 picks up a bit more noise, but as we go higher up to ISO 3200 the GH6 is a bit less noisy, not by a full stop but maybe a half stop cleaner. At ISO 6400 we can already see a big gap in quality difference. There is a lot of colorful noise on the GH5, and it's already worse than the GH6 at 12800. So the quality difference becomes quite apparent in these higher ISOs. This again shows us there's definitely one stop of a difference between the GH5 and the GH6. A great show from the GH6. When we use the pixel by pixel readout on the GH5, it's not as much cropped in as on the GH6. On the GH6 we have a crop factor of 1.5 in UHD, and on the GH5 we have a crop factor of 1.4. But that shouldn't matter because we are still reading out the same amount of samples on each of the sensors. At base both cameras show a tiny bit of noise, but they are comparable. But as soon as we hit ISO 3200 the GH6 has the edge over the GH5, but not as significant as before. Even though the amount of noise at ISO 6400 on the GH5 is the same as on the GH6 at ISO 12800, we already see a color shift towards green on the GH6. I'm a bit surprised by that result. But even with the color shifting, I would still say that there is a lot more detail and more pleasing noise on the GH6 in comparison to the GH5. When we take a look at both cameras' full HD pixel by pixel readout, there's also about a stop of difference that comes quite apparent at higher ISOs. Also, the noise on the GH5 seems to be much bigger, more contrasty and more colorful. In this example you can see how much of a color difference is between the GH6 and the GH5 at ISO 6400. And again, even though the GH6 has a green color cast over the image, there is still less noise that can be filtered out quite easily, and it's not as ugly as on the GH5. To sum it up, the GH6 made a big leap forward when it comes to noise performance. I would say there is a stop of an improvement on the GH6 in comparison to the GH5, which is great to see because the GH6 has a higher megapixel count and delivers nicer and cleaner images, which again makes me wonder why the ISO range is limited to 12,800, since the higher ISOs are much more usable on the GH6 than on the GH5. Now we come to the much tougher battle between the GH6 and the S1. And as we already saw in the comparison between the GH5 and the S1 delivers outstanding noise performance and delivers great images. It's still a benchmark when it comes to noise performance for full frame cameras above 20 megapixels. Also, we should not forget that the S1 has a dual gain sensor, so it can read out two base ISOs at both ISO 6400 and ISO 4000 when shooting in vlog. In their highest resolutions, 5.7K on the GH6 and 5.9K on the S1, both cameras show great quality at base ISO and ISO 800. At ISO 3200, the GH6 even takes over the S1 and has a touch better noise level than the full frame camera. But as we already know, the S1 is a beast because of its second native ISO at ISO 4000. This is where the S1 obliterates the GH6 and has a much cleaner image. At 6400, the S1 is about a stop cleaner than the GH6, but we already see a green color cast on the S1. At 12,800, I honestly think that the advantage of the S1 is not as extreme as I thought it would be. Both cameras show some intense noise, but considering that the GH6 has a 4 times smaller sensor, this is actually amazing. And considering the pixel count on both cameras is more or less the same, so also the separate sensors on the sensor are 4 times smaller than on the S1. The S1 has one advantage: the ISO range goes up by 2 full stops, so if you are desperate for coverage and you just need to get a shot, it's great to be able to go 2 stops up further. The GH6 doesn't have that advantage. You are limited to ISO 12,800. When we compare the full sensor readout in UHD on both cameras, it's basically the same story. They are very comparable up to ISO 4000, where the S1 takes over. But it loses its advantage where the GH6 picks up quite quickly. But now we take a look at the UHD crop on each sensors. The S1 takes an APS-C sized portion of the sensor and the GH6 takes a Super 16 sized portion of its sensor. In UHD, both cameras show good performance at the lower ISOs, but as we hit ISO 4000, I would expect the S1 to smoke the GH6. But funny enough, I find the performance of the S1 at ISO 4000 comparable to the GH6. Yes, the S1 is a touch cleaner, but the difference is not as severe as before. But at ISO 6400, the S1 has a visible advantage over the GH6 and far more contrast at ISO 12800. Again, I'm surprised. I didn't expect the GH6 to hold up this well. Now we go a step further and compare the full HD sensor crop on both cameras. On the S1 we get a crop of about 3 times, which is about Super 16 sized, and we get a crop of 6 on the GH6, which is comparable to Super 8. At base, the GH6 seems to be quite cleaner, almost by a full stop. This continues up to ISO 6400. Even the second native ISO of the S1 at ISO 4000 shows more noise than the GH6 at ISO 3200. Only at ISO 6400 is where we see a slight advantage of the S1, and at ISO 12800 and above, the S1 shows much better color and contrast due to the GH6's color cast. To sum it all up, the S1 shows its advantage with the full sensor readout, and also the second native ISO at ISO 4000 is just great and a great advantage. But honestly, I thought the S1 would smoke the GH6 due to its full frame sensor and much bigger pixels. But the GH6 is only 1 stop behind at best, and up to ISO 3200 I think the GH6 has sometimes a cleaner image than the full frame camera. And when you crop into UHD, the GH6 can already rival the S1, so this is a great performance. What's my takeaway? This is not a scientific test that will show you how good this camera will perform when you shoot in low light, but it can give you an indication of what to expect. the GH6 is still a Micro Four Thirds camera, but it's a darn good one, and that it can rival a full frame camera is really surprising to me. I really didn't think that the sensor performance would come close to the sensor of the S1. The S1 has an amazing sensor inside that we also see in other manufacturers like Sony and Cam, and I think also DJI. So we know that the sensor is amazing and that the performance is good. But all things considered, I will also have to look at the price, and the GH6 is a $2,200 camera. You shouldn't forget that. And the sensor of the S1 is also in cameras like the S5, which is $500 cheaper than the GH6. So you get outstanding performance even on cheaper cameras. And the GH5 is still a great performer. It's only half the price in comparison to the GH6, and it's only about a stop worse when it comes to the higher ISOs. So it comes down to your needs and your budget. And the GH6 has so many great features that I think are amazing. But if you don't need those features, if your expectations aren't met with the GH6's features and specs, you can look at other cameras. All these cameras offer amazing value for their money. But it's great to see that Micro Four Thirds is still innovating, and we see such a great sensor and such great noise performance that we didn't see since the GH5S. But there are other features that I should compare between the GH6, the GH5 and the S1. And if you want to see that, you should subscribe to my channel, because these are the tests that I will do in the future. We will look at handling, sharpness, slow motion, and all those other features that are important to us filmmakers. And I hope this video was useful to you. If you have anything to add or to discuss, please feel free to comment down below. I would gladly answer all your questions and what you want to talk about. And that's it from me. And I hope you have a nice day and create something extraordinary.